In the Old Testament, there is a name that shows up in almost every moment of crisis in Israel's history: Baal. He wasn't just one more idol among the crowd of pagan gods. He was the chief rival of the true God for centuries. That is why he is the false god most mentioned in the Bible. And do you know what's most frightening? Israel, even knowing the true God, could not break free from him. The struggle against Baal was so intense that it almost destroyed the faith and the nation of God's chosen people. That's why in this video we will seek to understand why the worship of this false god was so incredibly seductive, and how the Lord showed in spectacular fashion that Baal was nothing more than a fraud. The word Baal is a title that means Lord or owner in the Semitic languages. The curious thing is that every city had its own Lord, its own Baal, all of them considered different manifestations of the same deity. In other words, Baal was like a franchise of false gods. Each region adapted its version, but in the end it was always the same deceiving spirit. The Canaanites believed that Baal was the god who sustained life. He was responsible for rain, for the fertility of the earth and of human beings, and for the harvest. His story was told as a constant struggle against chaos. First, Baal was said to have defeated Yam, the sea dragon, symbol of primordial chaos. But the threat did not end there. The god Mot, whose name means death, represented drought, barrenness, and everything that destroyed life. He even defeated Baal and took him to the realm of the dead. Without Baal, the rain ceased and the land became sterile. But Anat, his sister and consort, found the body, avenged herself on Mot, and brought Baal back to life. From then on, he would rise again every year, in the same cycle of death and resurrection, explaining the rainy seasons that sustained Canaanite agriculture. And here lies the key to the problem. Israel lived in an agricultural land. They depended entirely on rain to survive. No wonder the temptation to worship Baal was so great. It seemed like the perfect shortcut to material security. If a Hebrew was going through hardships, what would it cost him to make an offering to Baal to see if life improved? But the Lord did not approve of such an attitude. Scholars have noticed that some psalms seem to steal for God the titles and attributes that were once given to Baal. A clear example is Psalm 29. There, the voice of God is described as the thunder that echoes over the waters, as the storm that breaks the cedars of Lebanon, as the earthquake that shakes deserts and strips forests bare. All of these were images associated with Baal, the supposed lord of the storm. But the psalmist makes it clear, it is not Baal who commands the rain, the thunder, and the lightning. It is the Lord, the true owner of creation. Even Lebanon, a sacred place linked to Baal, appears humiliated, the mountains skipping like calves before the power of Israel's God. It is as if the psalm were a holy irony, showing who was truly in control. And there's more. The peoples of that region believed that Baal could also restore the life of someone who had died. But in 1 Kings 17, Elijah raised the son of the widow of Zarephath, not in the name of Baal, but by the power of the living God. God was demonstrating his dominion in the very sphere that many of that time believed only Baal had power. Speaking of Elijah, it was this prophet who led the famous episode of the Battle of the Gods on Mount Carmel. This was not just an isolated scene, but a confrontation loaded with meaning. The context was that for 3.5 years, not a single drop of rain had fallen in Israel. The land was dry, the people desperate, and the God who supposedly controlled the storm, the rains, and the fertility of the land remained silent. Where was Baal, the so-called Lord of the Clouds? He could not deliver what he promised. And that silence was in itself a blow to his reputation, for his specialty was supposedly sending rain. Elijah then gathered the people before Mount Carmel, located between the Phoenicians, official worshippers of Baal, and Israel, who were supposedly to follow Yahweh. The prophet asked a question that still echoes today. How long will you waver between two masters? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. It was time to decide. 2 altars would be prepared, 2 sacrifices offered, and the God who answered with fire would be recognized as the true one. But the choice of this sign was not random. The fire carried 3 deep meanings. First, fire was a sign of the very presence of God. Many times when God manifested himself, fire appeared. in the burning bush before Moses, in the pillar of fire that guided Israel in the desert, and even in the vision of the throne in Ezekiel. The idea here is that the true God would have to reveal himself in a real way. Second, fire was associated with Baal's own domain. In Canaanite traditions, he is depicted wielding lightning and thunderbolts. Baal was known as the Lord of Fire and Storm. That is why the challenge was so strategic. If Elijah were answered, Yahweh would be defeating Baal precisely in the area of his greatest pride. And third, fire symbolized the acceptance of the sacrifice. This type of offering was made when the people asked something specific from the deity. And the request of the moment was obvious: the end of the drought. If the fire came, the prayer would be answered, and the later rain could only be attributed to the God who accepted the sacrifice. Thus, fire and rain were closely connected in this challenge. The prophets of Baal started early, shouting, dancing around the altar, even cutting themselves. This practice was part of mourning rituals, since in ancient texts it was said that even the gods shed blood when Baal died. All this created a spectacle of despair. But despite the frantic effort, nothing happened. The biblical text describes it with irony. No one answered. No one paid attention. Elijah, on the other hand, mocked them, saying perhaps Baal was meditating, busy, traveling, or even sleeping. This is interesting because in Ugaritic texts involving this god, when the goddess Anat goes looking for Baal, she finds him hunting. The Ugaritic literature that portrays his death repeats the refrain that he needs to be awakened. Elijah's provocation was not just sarcasm, but a direct jab at the Canaanite religious tradition itself. When it was Elijah's turn, he rebuilt the altar of the Lord. He placed the offering on it, and so that no one could say it was coincidence or human trickery, he ordered everything to be soaked with water 3 times until it overflowed and filled the trench around it. Humanly speaking, there was no chance any fire could burn there. Then Elijah prayed, "O Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you are God and that you are turning their hearts back to you." And at that moment fire fell from heaven. It not only burned the sacrifice, but consumed the wood, the stones, the water, and even the ground around it. It was a spectacular, undeniable response. The people, faced with that scene, fell on their faces and declared in unison, "The Lord is God, the Lord is God." This was not just an isolated miracle, but a direct message. Baal, whose very name means Lord, proved powerless, and Yahweh, whom the Israelites called Adonai, also Lord in Hebrew, showed who truly held authority over creation. And if the fire from heaven had already humiliated Baal before everyone, what came next sealed the victory. The rain finally returned to the land, ending the years of drought. In other words, the God who sent fire was also the God who sent water. He triumphed in every area people claimed Baal could dominate. The episode on Mount Carmel not only unmasked a false god, but forever marked that only the Lord is worthy of devotion. But here then comes the question: if Yahweh was the national God of Israel, the God who delivered the people from Egypt and gave them the promised land, why were there so many prophets of Baal spread throughout its territory? The explanation is far less absurd than it may seem. It is important to remember that even before Israel existed as a nation, Baal was already an extremely popular god in Canaan. When Israel and Judah settled in that region, this cult did not simply disappear. On the contrary, it remained active within Israelite territory. This happened because Israel disobeyed God's command to completely remove the Canaanite peoples. As a consequence, God allowed these peoples to remain, and along with them, their idolatrous practices. Idolatry, then, was not only the result of the people's weakness, but also part of divine judgment. The Lord turned the false gods into snares, so that Israel would learn, often through suffering, that He alone is the true God. In addition, kings and queens who favored these idols, such as Ahab and Jezebel, sponsored hundreds of prophets, supporting them with food, influence, and prestige. Jezebel, for example, brought priests and prophets of Baal from her homeland, Sidon, and installed them in Israel as part of an idolatrous religious policy. Another intriguing question is, if Baal was a false and powerless god, why did Israel fall into worshiping him so often? The answer is not so simple, but it reveals much about the human heart. First, Canaanite religion had a visual and concrete appeal, while the God of Israel revealed himself as the absolutely other, without images or representations. The Canaanites filled their cities with statues, sacred poles, bronze bulls, and female fertility figures. The Hebrew people, accustomed to dealing with an invisible God, could find it difficult to relate to such an abstract concept. Meanwhile, Baal and the other false gods came with tangible images that seemed to give form to the divine. They were gods you could see, but it didn't stop there. The worship of Baal also offered a carnal attraction. The religious festivals were filled with drunkenness, orgies, and ritual prostitution. In other words, worship was used as an excuse to indulge in forbidden desires. While worshiping Yahweh required holiness, discipline, and faithfulness, Baal offered a package of immediate pleasure. It was idolatry packaged as entertainment. Another factor was desperate pragmatism. When droughts, crises, or military defeats arose, syncretism came into play. They did not officially abandon Yahweh, but they opened loopholes, trying to secure benefits from other gods. It was like having a spiritual plan B. Archaeology itself confirms this tendency. In the Sinai desert, inscriptions were found asking for the blessing of Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, showing that the people mixed true worship with idolatry, even considering that God had a wife. Perhaps you are thinking, okay, this is ancient history, but what does it have to do with me? The answer is everything. Because the idols have changed names, but they continue offering the same false promises: deceptive prosperity, pleasure without commitment, security without trusting in God. The modern Baals don't have stone altars, but they occupy the altars of our hearts. Money, status, power, relationships, all can become our lords when they steal God's place. Elijah's question still echoes. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. Now, if you want to go deeper in your Bible study, check out my exclusive resource, Mind Maps of all the books of the Bible, designed to make your learning easier and more effective. You'll also get bonus materials to take your Bible journey to the next level. Don't miss out. Click the link in the description to get instant access. And before you go, don't forget to watch the next video that's showing up on your screen. It's one you won't want to miss. Stay in peace, and see you next time.